He was born a prince of the East Coast establishment, yet he came of age amidst the carnage and kamikazes on the blood-slicked decks of a World War II destroyer. He was the loyal technocrat who helped operate the brutal war machine in Vietnam, only to become the man who spent the rest of his life desperately trying to stop the next war from starting. He was at once a cold-blooded Wall Street power lawyer and the only Secretary of State in the modern American century who dared to throw his resignation in the face of ultimate power to save the lives of anonymous soldiers. The life of Cyrus Vance is a stark, solitary, and profoundly human chronicle of the war between loyalty and conscience. The story of an outsider who dared to say no in a Washington drunk on its own power. Cyrus Roberts Vance entered the world on March 27, 1917, just 10 days before the United States abandoned its neutrality to join the slaughter of World War I. It was a fitting beginning for a man whose entire existence would be defined by the tension between peace and conflict. While Europe burned, the Vance household in Clarksburg, West Virginia, remained an island of structured calm. He was a child of the establishment from his first breath, the son of John Carl Vance, a wealthy insurance executive, and Amy Roberts, a matriarch of formidable intellect. He was not born to struggle, he was born to lead. However, the comforts of wealth offer no protection against the cruelty of fate. In fact, tragedy often strikes the privileged with a sharper knife because they have further to fall. When Cyrus was just 5 years old, his world collapsed. His father contracted pneumonia, a death sentence in the days before antibiotics, and died, leaving a void that would define the rest of Cyrus's life. The death of a father is a tectonic event for any boy, but for Cyrus, it wasn't just a loss of love, it was an inheritance of duty. Almost overnight, he transformed from a carefree child into the little man of the house. He didn't rebel or act out. Instead, he adopted a premature maturity that unsettled adults, becoming the boy who checked the locks and carried an invisible weight on his narrow shoulders. This sense of stoic responsibility was forged into steel at boarding school. At the Kent School in Connecticut, under the stern gaze of Anglican monks, Vance learned the code that would govern his existence: simplicitas. The school's philosophy was temperance in all things. Don't be too loud. Don't be too flashy. Don't show pain. It was here, in the cold dormitories of New England, that Vance built the armor he would wear for the rest of his life. He learned that to be a leader was to be invisible, to serve without demanding applause. By the time he arrived at Yale University in 1935, Vance was the perfect prototype of the old blue elite. He was handsome, athletic, and popular, playing varsity hockey and joining the secret scroll in Key Society. Yet, while he and his classmates debated economics and law in leather-bound libraries, the world outside was catching fire. The late 1930s were a time of gathering storms. Hitler was screaming from podiums in Germany, and Japan was marching across Asia. Vance, studying within the Gothic spires of Yale, seemed safe in a bubble of tradition. But he was watching. He graduated in 1939 and finished law school in 1942, just as the Japanese bombs at Pearl Harbor shattered the American illusion of safety. The theoretical lawyer was about to meet the practical reality of death. True to the code of his class, Vance didn't wait to be drafted. He joined the United States Navy, transitioning from the hush of the law library to the deafening roar of the Pacific Theater. He was assigned as a gunnery officer on the USS Hale, a destroyer. For a man who valued logic and order, the Pacific War was a nightmare of chaos. He saw action at Bougainville and Tarawa, places where the ocean turned red and the air smelled of burning oil and cordite. Tarawa, in particular, was a slaughterhouse. From the deck of his ship, Vance watched Marines storm the beaches into the teeth of Japanese machine guns. He witnessed the terrifying resolve of kamikaze pilots, men who had weaponized their own suicides. This experience installed a permanent skepticism in him regarding military glory. He realized that war was not a chess match played by gentlemen. It was a butcher's shop where plans evaporated the moment the shooting started. He left the Navy in 1946 with a deep respect for soldiers, but a profound suspicion of the men who sent them to die. Returning to civilian life, Vance joined the prestigious Wall Street law firm of Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett. The post-war years were a gold rush for American corporate power, and Vance became a master of the boardroom. He wasn't the type of lawyer who shouted in courtrooms. He was a fixer. When giant corporations were at each other's throats, they called Cy, he would sit at the head of a mahogany table, listen for hours without speaking, and then offer a solution so logical and fair that it saved everyone's face and fortune. He was brilliant, wealthy, and seemingly content, living the perfect American dream with his wife Grace and their growing family. But the ghost of his father and the lessons of Kent School still haunted him. Making money was easy, but it wasn't service. He felt a nagging emptiness, a sense that his talents were being wasted on contracts when they should be used for the country. That opportunity came in 1957, not from the White House, but from the Senate. Lyndon B. Johnson, the titanic, foul-mouthed senator from Texas, needed a special counsel for a committee investigating military preparedness. He needed a lawyer who was smarter than the generals and tougher than the politicians. He hired Cyrus Vance. The relationship between Johnson and Vance was a study in contrasts. Johnson was a force of nature, loud, crude, emotional, and manipulative. Vance was a creature of logic, polite, refined, and ethical. Yet Johnson loved him. He loved that Vance could take his chaotic directives and turn them into coherent legal strategies. This was Vance's apprenticeship in power. He learned how Washington really worked, the horse trading, the leverage, the dark arts of political survival. He impressed everyone with his efficiency and his refusal to leak to the press. In a city of peacocks, the gray owl was king. When John F. Kennedy swept into the White House in 1961, bringing with him the best and the brightest, Vance was a natural recruit. He was appointed general counsel for the Department of Defense under Robert McNamara. His job was to bring legal oversight to the massive American military machine during the height of the Cold War. It was a time of immense tension, with the Soviet Union testing nuclear weapons and the United States scrambling to maintain superiority. Vance worked in the Pentagon, helping to reorganize the military and assert civilian control over the armed forces. Then came October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Soviet missiles were spotted in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, capable of striking Washington within minutes. The generals in the Pentagon, the men Vance worked with every day, were clamoring for war. They wanted to bomb the missile sites. They wanted to invade. They assured the president that the Soviets would back down. Vance was in the room, witnessing the terrifying momentum of the military-industrial complex. He saw the gleam in the eyes of men like General Curtis LeMay, who seemed almost eager for a fight. But Vance, the lawyer, looked at the evidence and saw only catastrophe. He understood that a single miscalculation would mean the end of civilization. He threw his support behind the blockade, the quarantine, advocating for a measured response that left room for negotiation. When the Soviets finally blinked and the ships turned back, the relief in Washington was palpable. But for Vance, the lesson was darker. He realized that the experts were often wrong, and that the drive toward war was a powerful current that required constant, exhausting resistance. As the Kennedy administration transitioned into the Johnson years following the tragic assassination in Dallas, Vance's star continued to rise. He was promoted to Secretary of the Army and then Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was now the second most powerful man in the Pentagon, serving a president who trusted him implicitly. But the world was changing. The clear moral lines of World War II and the successful brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis were about to be replaced by a murky, bloody quagmire in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was waiting. Vance entered the Vietnam era as a believer. He was a company man, signing orders and reviewing bombing targets with the clinical detachment of a bureaucrat. He believed in the mission. He believed in containing communism. But unlike many of his peers who insulated themselves with maps and statistics, Vance had a habit of looking closer. As the war escalated, sending thousands of young Americans into the jungles, the skepticism that had been planted in him on the decks of the USS Hale began to bloom. He was about to embark on a journey that would transform him from a loyal executor of war into a tortured advocate for peace, a journey that would set him on a collision course with history. The transition from the cool intellectual glamour of John F. Kennedy's Camelot to the raw, imposing force of Lyndon B. Johnson's Washington was not just a change of administration. It was a change in the atmospheric pressure of the Capitol. When Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963, Cyrus Vance was serving as the Secretary of the Army. He was a man of the establishment, and like the rest of the nation, he was in shock. But the machinery of government does not stop for grief. In fact, it accelerates. Lyndon Johnson, the new president, was a man consumed by two great desires: to build a great society of racial justice and economic equality at home, and to project American strength abroad. He viewed the world through the lens of a Texas populist. Power was something you grabbed, held, and used to bully your opponents into submission. He trusted Cyrus Vance because Vance was the perfect counterweight to Johnson's own volatility. Vance was the cooling rod in the nuclear reactor of LBJ's White House. In early 1964, Johnson promoted Vance to Deputy Secretary of Defense. This made him the number 2 man in the Pentagon, second only to Robert McNamara. But in the hierarchical reality of Washington, being number 2 meant Vance was the chief operating officer of the Cold War. While McNamara focused on high-level strategy and budget statistics, Vance ran the day-to-day operations of the most colossal military machine in human history. He was the man who ensured the gears turned, the supplies moved, and the orders were executed. It was in this role that Vance walked, eyes wide open, into the tragedy of Vietnam. To understand Vance's culpability and his eventual redemption, one must understand the seduction of the Vietnam War in 1964. It did not start as a disaster. It started as a math problem. The best and the brightest, McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and Vance himself, believed that the war could be managed like a corporate merger. They believed that if they applied enough pressure, calculated in bombing tonnage and troop deployments, the North Vietnamese would inevitably reach a breaking point and sue for peace. It was a war fought on spreadsheets, and on paper, America was winning. Vance was a loyal lieutenant. When the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in August 1964, a murky, confused naval skirmish that LBJ used as a pretext to escalate the war, Vance was in the Pentagon helping to draft the congressional resolution that would give the president a blank check for war. At this stage, Vance did not dissent. He was a lawyer serving his client, and his client was the President of the United States. He believed in the chain of command. He believed in the containment of communism. But as 1965 rolled into 1966, the math problem began to bleed. Operation Rolling Thunder, the massive aerial bombardment campaign against North Vietnam, was launched. Vance was deeply involved in the targeting selection. He would sit in the Situation Room, looking at maps of bridges and supply depots, approving strikes. But unlike his peers, who saw targets as abstract coordinates, Vance began to see the human cost. Reports were coming back not just of destroyed bridges, but of destroyed villages, of civilian casualties, of a resilient enemy that refused to behave according to American calculations. Vance was known in the Pentagon for his open-door policy. He listened to the intelligence officers who whispered that the war was not going well. He read the reports from the field that contradicted the rosy statistics being fed to the press. A quiet dissonance began to grow in his mind. The loyalty that had defined his life, loyalty to the president, loyalty to the system, was beginning to clash with a deeper loyalty to the truth. He saw that the United States was falling into a trap. We were sending hundreds of thousands of boys into a jungle war where victory was undefined. Yet publicly, Vance remained the stoic soldier. He defended the administration's policies. He testified before Congress. He did his duty. This period is the darkest stain on his legacy, a time when his silence facilitated a disaster, but it was also the crucible that burned away his illusions. He was learning day by day that military power has limits. Then, in the summer of 1967, the war came home. Detroit exploded. In July 1967, racial tensions in Detroit boiled over into one of the most violent riots in American history. The police lost control. Snipers were on rooftops. City blocks were burning. It looked like a war zone. President Johnson, frantic and fearing a nationwide insurrection, ordered federal troops into the city. But he didn't just send generals. He sent Cyrus Vance as his personal envoy to oversee the military response. This mission revealed the true character of the man. When Vance arrived in Detroit, the city was a cauldron of hate and fear. The National Guard, poorly trained and terrified, were shooting at shadows. The police were cracking heads. The instinct of the military commanders was to use overwhelming force, to treat Detroit like Saigon. Vance said no. He refused to let the situation escalate into a massacre. He imposed strict rules of engagement. He ordered that federal troops could not load their weapons unless explicitly ordered to do so by an officer. He walked the streets himself, amidst the smoke and the broken glass, projecting a calm authority that lowered the temperature. He prioritized de-escalation over domination. While others saw insurgents, Vance saw American citizens in pain. He understood that you cannot restore order by declaring war on your own people. He successfully quieted the city with minimal loss of life by the federal troops under his direct command. It was a masterclass in restraint. Fresh from the fires of Detroit, Vance was immediately thrown into another crisis in November 1967. This time, it was in the Mediterranean. Greece and Turkey, two NATO allies, were on the brink of war over the island of Cyprus. A conflict between them would have shattered the southern flank of NATO and handed a massive victory to the Soviet Union. President Johnson sent Vance to mediate. He gave him a simple order: stop the war. Vance flew into a diplomatic hurricane. He shuttled between Athens, Ankara, and Nicosia, sleeping on the plane, living on coffee and cigarettes. The Turks were mobilizing their invasion fleet. The Greeks were mobilizing their army. The window for peace was closing by the hour. Vance used a technique that would become his signature, the exhaustion method. He listened. He let the angry generals and politicians scream and vent. He absorbed their rage with infinite patience, and when they were tired, he offered them a way out. He negotiated the withdrawal of Greek troops and the stand down of the Turkish invasion force. He didn't threaten them with American might. He reasoned with them about their own self-interest. He stopped the war. It was a dazzling diplomatic triumph, proving that one man, armed only with a briefcase and a cool head, could stop armies in their tracks. It reinforced his growing belief that negotiation was a more powerful tool than coercion. But the victories in Detroit and Cyprus could not mask the rot in Vietnam, nor could they heal the physical agony Vance was enduring. For years, he had suffered from a debilitating back condition, a slipped disc that caused him constant, excruciating pain. By 1967, he was often working while lying flat on his back on a couch in his office, conducting meetings while staring at the ceiling, his face gray with pain. The physical pain mirrored the psychological burden. The Tet Offensive was on the horizon, but even before that, Vance knew the strategy was failing. He watched his boss, Robert McNamara, slowly disintegrate under the pressure, weeping in meetings and staring out windows. The administration was cannibalizing itself. In June 1967, citing his health, Cyrus Vance resigned as Deputy Secretary of Defense. It was a graceful exit. LBJ gave him the Medal of Freedom. The press hailed him as a dedicated public servant who had given his health for his country. He returned to his law practice in New York, hoping to find peace in the private sector. But he could not leave Vietnam behind. The war followed him. In early 1968, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion of American progress. The Viet Cong attacked every major city in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The American public turned against the war. Walter Cronkite declared the war a stalemate. LBJ, broken and besieged, convened a group of advisors known as the Wise Men to give him a verdict on the war. These were the titans of the establishment, generals, diplomats, and lawyers. Cyrus Vance was among them. In a smoke-filled room in the White House, the Wise Men delivered the coup de grace. They told the president the truth. The war could not be won. The cost was too high. The country was tearing apart. Vance, the former loyalist, joined the chorus of dissent. He looked Johnson in the eye, the man he admired, the man who had given him power, and told him that the war had to end. It was a betrayal of affection, but an act of supreme patriotism. Johnson was stunned. When the Wise Men turned against him, he knew it was over. On March 31, 1968, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Vance was then tapped for one final grueling mission for the Johnson administration, the Paris peace talks. He spent months in Paris sitting across the table from the North Vietnamese. It was a maddening, slow process. They argued for weeks about the shape of the table. They argued about the agenda. Vance saw the face of the enemy up close. He saw their resolve. He realized that no amount of bombing would break a people fighting for their independence. By the time Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 and Vance returned to private life, the transformation was complete. The cold warrior who had entered the Pentagon in 1961 believing in the utility of force had been forged by the fires of Vietnam into something else entirely. He had seen the limits of power. He had seen the arrogance of the intellect. He had seen that winning was a dangerous illusion. He spent the Nixon years in the wilderness of private law, watching as Kissinger and Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia, watching the death toll mount. He remained silent publicly, adhering to the code of the establishment, but privately, his philosophy was solidifying. He vowed that if he ever held power again, he would do things differently. He would prioritize human rights. He would prioritize arms control. He would prioritize peace, not as a slogan, but as a rigorous, difficult discipline. He would not have to wait long for that opportunity. In 1976, a peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter would shock the world by winning the White House. Carter was looking for a man who could restore America's moral standing in the world. He didn't want a cowboy. He didn't want a schemer. He wanted a man of integrity. He picked up the phone and called Cyrus Vance. The stage was set for the final act. The man who had learned the hard lessons of the 1960s was about to be given the keys to American foreign policy. But he was walking into a trap. He was about to face a new rival, a new world order, and a crisis that would demand the ultimate sacrifice. January 20th, 1977. Washington, D.C. was frozen under a gray winter sky, but the mood on the ground was electric with a strange, unfamiliar energy, hope. Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, walked down Pennsylvania Avenue holding hands with his wife Rosalind. It was a symbolic break from the imperial presidency of the Nixon and Ford years. Carter promised a government as good and decent as the American people. He promised to wipe away the stains of Watergate and the blood of Vietnam. He wanted a foreign policy based not on cynical power plays, but on human rights and moral principles. To build this new world, he needed an architect. He didn't want another Henry Kissinger, a superstar who treated the State Department as his personal fiefdom. He wanted a partner. He wanted someone steady, experienced, and above all, honest. He chose Cyrus Vance. At 59 years old, Vance returned to government as the 57th Secretary of State. He was the perfect foil to Carter. Where Carter was an outsider who viewed Washington with suspicion, Vance was the ultimate insider, a man who knew every lever and pulley of the federal machinery. But they shared a crucial bond. Both men believed that the United States had lost its soul, and they were determined to find it. Vance entered the State Department with a noble vision to replace the blunt instrument of military force with the quiet power of diplomacy. He sought détente with the Soviet Union and peace in the Middle East. But from day one, he faced a formidable counterweight within the White House, Zbigniew Brzezinski. While Vance embodied the calm, methodical establishment, Brzezinski was a lightning bolt of anxiety who viewed the Cold War as a zero-sum game. This clash between Vance's belief in negotiation and Brzezinski's hunger for leverage would become the defining battle for the soul of the Carter presidency. It was not just a clash of personalities. It was a battle for the soul of American foreign policy. Vance believed in the slow, grinding work of diplomacy, the quiet conversations, the compromises, the patience. Brzezinski believed in the grand gesture, the covert action, the public confrontation. For the first 2 years, Vance seemed to be winning. His first major test was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, known as SALT II. The goal was to put a cap on the nuclear arsenals of the superpowers. For Vance, this was holy work. He flew to Moscow, meeting with the grim-faced Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko. The negotiations were excruciatingly technical, counting warheads, calculating throw weights, defining what counted as a launcher. Vance was in his element. He was patient. He refused to be baited by Soviet bluster or Brzezinski's leaks to the press back home. He built a rapport with the Soviets based on mutual respect. He convinced them that Carter was serious about peace. It was a slog, mile by painful mile, but Vance kept pushing the boulder up the hill, driven by the memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He knew how close the world was to the edge, but the crowning achievement of Vance's tenure, and perhaps the high watermark of 20th century diplomacy, came in September 1978. Camp David. The Middle East was a powder keg. Egypt and Israel had fought 4 wars in 30 years. The hatred ran deep, fueled by blood and religion. President Carter, in a gamble that his advisors thought was political suicide, invited Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to the secluded presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. For 13 days, the world was locked out. Inside the cabins of Camp David, the tension was suffocating. Sadat and Begin could barely stand to be in the same room. They shouted. They packed their bags to leave. The talks were on the verge of collapse half a dozen times. History often focuses on Carter's role as the mediator, or on the courage of Sadat and Begin. But the glue that held the fragile process together was Cyrus Vance. While Carter worked on the big picture, Vance worked the details. He spent hours with the Israeli and Egyptian legal teams drafting and redrafting single sentences until they were acceptable to both sides. He was the shock absorber. When Begin exploded in anger, Vance absorbed the blast. When Sadat grew impatient, Vance soothed him. He slept little, his back pain flaring constantly, but he never lost his composure. He was the good cop to Brzezinski's absence. Vance understood that peace wasn't about making people like each other. It was about finding a structure where their interests aligned. When the accords were finally signed on September 17, 1978, leading to a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that holds to this day, it was a triumph of the Vance philosophy. It proved that even the bitterest of enemies could find a way forward if you locked them in a room and refused to let them leave until they talked. Vance stood in the background at the signing ceremony, applauding politely, while the politicians took the bows. That was how he liked it. He didn't need the credit. He had the result. But the euphoria of Camp David was short-lived. The world was turning darker. By 1979, the fault lines in the Carter administration were cracking wide open. The global situation was deteriorating. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship. In Africa, Soviet proxies were advancing. And in the Persian Gulf, the island of stability known as Iran was beginning to tremble. The Shah of Iran, a longtime American ally, was losing his grip. Demonstrators were filling the streets of Tehran chanting, "Death to America." The Shah was a brutal autocrat, but he was our autocrat. The debate over Iran tore the Vance-Brzezinski rivalry into open warfare. Brzezinski wanted the Shah to crack down. He urged Carter to send a message of unconditional support for an iron fist response. He believed that losing Iran would be a catastrophic blow to American prestige. Vance, on the other hand, was reading the cables from the embassy. He saw that the Shah was finished. He argued that the United States should not tie itself to a sinking ship, especially one that violated every human rights principle Carter claimed to uphold. Vance urged the administration to reach out to the opposition, to prepare for a post-Shah Iran, to try to guide the revolution toward a moderate outcome rather than radicalizing it through blind support for a tyrant. Carter wavered. He was a man torn between his moral instincts and his geopolitical fears. The result was a paralyzed policy. The U.S. sent mixed signals, the Shah vacillated, and the revolution gathered steam like a runaway train. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. The Islamic Republic was born. For Brzezinski, this was proof of American weakness. He blamed Vance's soft approach for losing Iran. The knives were out. In the White House Situation Room, the atmosphere became toxic. Brzezinski began to bypass the State Department, setting up his own back channels, feeding the president intelligence that contradicted Vance's reports. Vance felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He saw that Carter, battered by inflation at home and humiliation abroad, was hardening. The president was losing faith in the quiet power of diplomacy. He was starting to listen to the siren song of force. Then came the hammer blow. June 1979, Vienna. Vance and Carter met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev to finally sign the SALT II treaty. It should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of years of work to make the world safer. They signed the document. They kissed on the cheek in the Russian style. But back in Washington, the Senate was already sharpening its knives. The mood had turned against détente. The hawks argued that the treaty was a surrender, and 6 months later the Soviet Union would drive a tank through Vance's life's work. Christmas 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion destroyed détente. It destroyed SALT II, which was never ratified. It vindicated Brzezinski's worldview in the eyes of the president. Carter, feeling betrayed by the Soviets, declared that aggression would be met with force. Vance watched in horror as the careful architecture of peace he had built was kicked over. The world was plunging back into the deep freeze of the Cold War. But the worst was yet to come. In November 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage. The crisis that would destroy the Carter presidency and end Cyrus Vance's career had begun. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on Carter to do something became unbearable. The American giant looked helpless. The yellow ribbons were tied around the old oak trees. The nightly news counted the days. Day 10, day 50, day 100. Vance remained the voice of reason in a room that was slowly going mad. He argued that the hostages were alive, and as long as they were alive, there was hope. He pointed out that the Iranians had no endgame. He urged patience. He urged sanctions. He urged the long game. But Brzezinski was whispering, rescue, military, helicopters, strike. Vance knew military history. He knew the logistics. He looked at the plan for a rescue mission deep inside a hostile city of millions, surrounded by mountains and deserts, and he saw a fantasy. He saw a desperate gamble born of frustration, not logic. He began to realize that he was losing the president. The quiet lawyer was being drowned out by the warrior. Cyrus Vance was approaching the Rubicon. He had spent his life saying yes to his country. He had served in war, in peace, in the Pentagon, and in the State Department. He had been the loyal soldier, but a line was being drawn in the sand of the Iranian desert. And for the first time in his life, Cyrus Vance was preparing to stop. The winter of 1980 was one of the bleakest seasons in the American century. In Washington, the cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, but the mood in the White House was funereal. The hostage crisis in Iran had dragged on for 5 months. Every night, the news broadcasts began with a count. Day 150, day 151, day 152. It was a drumbeat of humiliation that echoed in every living room across the country. President Jimmy Carter, the man of peace, was being portrayed as paralyzed and weak. His poll numbers were in free fall, and Senator Ted Kennedy was challenging him for the Democratic nomination. The presidency was slipping away. Inside the West Wing, the air was thick with frustration and exhaustion. The diplomatic track, Cyrus Vance's track, was stalling. Negotiations with the chaotic regime in Tehran were like trying to nail jelly to a wall. One day, there was a glimmer of hope. The next, the Ayatollah would denounce America as the great Satan, and the door would slam shut. In this vacuum of progress, the seduction of force began to take hold. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor, had been advocating for military action since the first days of the crisis. He argued that American prestige was bleeding out. He believed that a bold, decisive strike would not only free the hostages, but also restore American deterrence in the eyes of the Soviet Union. Slowly, methodically, he won over the president. Carter, A man who had resisted war with every fiber of his being was reaching his breaking point. He needed a victory. Deep in the Pentagon, a plan had been hatched. It was codenamed Operation Eagle Claw. To the military planners, it was a masterpiece of complexity. To Cyrus Vance, it looked like a Rube Goldberg machine designed to fail. The plan called for 8 Navy helicopters to fly from an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea, entering Iranian airspace under the cover of darkness. They would fly hundreds of miles to a remote spot in the desert, codenamed Desert 1. There, they would rendezvous with C-130 transport planes carrying fuel and Delta Force commandos. After refueling, they would fly to a hideout near Tehran, hide during the day, and then the next night drive into the city, storm the embassy, kill the guards, grab the hostages, and fly them out to a captured airfield. Vance looked at the plan with the eyes of a former Navy gunnery officer and the former Secretary of the Army. He saw 1,000 points of failure, sandstorms, mechanical breakdowns, the sheer unpredictability of urban combat. He knew that rescue missions in hostile territory rarely ended like they did in the movies. He argued that even if they got into Tehran, getting out would likely result in a bloodbath. Hostages killed in the crossfire, Iranian civilians dead, and the United States dragged into a full-scale war in the Middle East. He told the president, "This is a gamble, and we are betting with human lives." But Vance was becoming a ghost in the administration. His voice, once the anchor of Carter's policy, was now seen as an annoyance. He was the man saying wait when everyone else wanted to go. The tension between Vance and the White House staff became palpable. They stopped inviting him to certain meetings. They stopped copying him on certain memos. He was being frozen out. The turning point came on Thursday, April 10th, 1980. Vance was exhausted. He had been working 18-hour days for months. President Carter, perhaps out of kindness or perhaps, as history suggests, out of a desire to clear the obstacle from the room, urged Vance to take a long weekend off. "Go to Florida," Carter told him. "Rest. You need it." Vance hesitated. He knew the military option was being discussed, but Carter assured him that no final decision would be made while he was gone. Reassured by the president's word, Vance flew to Hobe Sound, Florida, for a rare moment of respite with his family. It was a fatal mistake. On Friday, April 11th, while Vance was walking on a beach in Florida, the National Security Council convened in the cabinet room. With the dissenting voice absent, the momentum for war was unchecked. Brzezinski, the CIA director, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff laid out the final plan for Operation Eagle Claw. They told the president the weather was good. They told him the Delta Force was ready. They told him the risks were manageable. Carter looked around the room. He saw confidence. He didn't see the empty chair where his Secretary of State should have been. He gave the order, "Proceed." When Vance returned to Washington on Monday morning, April 14th, the decision was a fait accompli. He walked into the State Department and was handed the news by his deputy, Warren Christopher. The mission was a go. The date was set for April 24th. Vance was stunned. He felt a double betrayal, professional and personal. The president had made the most momentous decision of his term behind his back. But Vance didn't explode in anger. He didn't leak to the press. He went to the White House. On Tuesday, April 15th, Vance met with Carter in the Oval Office. It was a painful, intimate confrontation. Vance laid out his case one last time. He spoke not as a subordinate, but as a friend. He listed the technical risks. He spoke of the geopolitical fallout. He warned that the Islamic world would ignite against the United States. "Mr. President," he said, "I believe this is wrong. It is a tragic mistake." Carter listened, his face pale and drawn. He respected Vance more than any man in his cabinet, but his mind was made up. "Cy," he said, "I have to do this. I cannot let those people rot in Tehran any longer." The two men stared at each other across the abyss of the decision. In that silence, Cyrus Vance knew what he had to do. For Vance, public service was a sacred trust, but he believed that a cabinet member owed the president his best judgment, and if he could not in good conscience support a policy that endangered the lives of citizens and the honor of the nation, he had no right to hold the office. He could not be the public face of a war he privately believed was a disaster. He went home to his wife, Grace. They sat in their kitchen, away from the secure lines and the spies. He told her he was going to resign. She didn't try to stop him. She knew him too well. She knew that for Cy, integrity wasn't a suit you put on for work. It was the skin you lived in. He drafted his letter of resignation. It was short, dignified, and devoid of self-pity. But here, Vance made a decision that separates him from almost every other political figure in history. He decided that he would not resign immediately. If he resigned before the mission launched, it would signal to the world that the administration was split. It might tip off the Iranians that something was happening. It would undermine the troops who were already moving into position. So he made a deal with his own conscience. He would stay in office until the mission was concluded. If the mission failed, he would leave. If the mission succeeded and the hostages were heroes, he would still leave. He would not bask in the glory of a plan he opposed. On April 21st, 3 days before the mission was scheduled to launch, Vance handed his resignation letter to President Carter. He asked Carter to keep it secret until after the operation. Carter accepted it with heavy sadness. He knew he was losing his moral compass. "I accept it," Carter said, "but I wish I didn't have to." The stage was now set for the tragedy. The helicopters were gathering on the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. The Delta Force commandos were checking their weapons. The president was praying in the White House chapel. And in the State Department, Cyrus Vance went through the motions of his job, a dead man walking. He sat in his office looking out at the Potomac River, carrying the terrible weight of a secret that was about to explode. He was the only man in Washington who had said no, and now all he could do was wait and watch as the disaster he predicted came rushing toward them out of the desert night. On the evening of April 24th, 1980, the sun dipped below the horizon of the Arabian Sea, plunging the world into a darkness that felt heavy with omen. On the flight deck of the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, the air smelled of jet fuel and salt spray. 8 massive RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters sat crouching on the steel deck, their rotors folded like the wings of giant dormant insects. These were the machines chosen to carry out the most audacious rescue mission in American history. Inside the White House, it was mid-afternoon. The windows were closed. The curtains were drawn. President Jimmy Carter sat in the Situation Room, a small, windowless command center in the basement of the West Wing. He was surrounded by his generals, his spies, and his advisors. The atmosphere was brittle with tension. They were gambling the presidency, the lives of 52 hostages, and the reputation of the United States military on a plan that required perfect timing, perfect weather, and perfect luck. Notably absent from the inner circle of tactical command was Cyrus Vance. He was still the Secretary of State, but he was a man apart. He had already signed his resignation letter. He was going through the motions of his office, attending routine diplomatic meetings, keeping up appearances to ensure the Iranians suspected nothing. But his mind was thousands of miles away, in the dark sky over Iran, fearing that the physics of chaos were about to assert themselves against the arrogance of power. The mission, Operation Eagle Claw, began with a roar. The 8 helicopters lifted off from the Nimitz and turned north, heading toward the Iranian coast. Their destination was a remote salt flat in the Dashti Kavir Desert, codenamed Desert 1. There, they would rendezvous with C-130 transport planes flying in from Oman, refuel, load up the Delta Force commandos, and then hide until the next night to strike Tehran. For the first 2 hours, the mission seemed to be holding. The helicopters slipped into Iranian airspace undetected, but the desert has defenses that do not show up on satellite photos. As the helicopters flew low to avoid radar, they slammed into a phenomenon known to meteorologists as a hayboob, a massive suspended cloud of fine dust. It wasn't a sandstorm in the traditional sense. It was a floating fog of talcum powder-like dust that swallowed light and sound. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were flying blind. They were under strict orders to maintain radio silence to avoid detection. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't talk to the carrier. They were encased in a swirling brown void. The temperature inside the helicopter soared. The dust clogged the air filters. Vertigo set in, a terrifying sensation where a pilot loses the ability to distinguish up from down. This was the friction that Cyrus Vance had warned about. In the sterile briefing rooms of the Pentagon, weather is a variable you plan for. In the reality of war, it is a monster that eats plans alive. One helicopter, suffering a rotor blade malfunction, abandoned the mission and landed in the desert. Another, its navigation systems fried by the dust and the heat, turned back to the carrier. By the time the formation emerged from the dust cloud and touched down on the moonscape of Desert 1, they were already down to 6 helicopters. 6 was the absolute minimum required to carry the Delta Force team and the hostages out of Tehran. The margin for error had evaporated. Desert 1 was a surreal scene. In the middle of the pitch-black desert, the roar of C-130 engines and helicopter rotors was deafening. Boots crunched on the salt flat. Men shouted over the wind. The commandos, led by the legendary Colonel Charlie Beckwith, were ready. They were hardened warriors, eager to go. But the machines were dying. As the crews frantically inspected the remaining 6 helicopters, a hydraulic pump failure was discovered in one of the birds. The fluid was leaking out. It could not fly. The math was cold and absolute. They needed 6 helicopters. They had 5. On the ground at Desert 1, Colonel Beckwith looked at the broken machine, then at his men. He got on the satellite radio to Washington. "Abort," he said. "We have to abort." In the White House Situation Room, the word hung in the air like a curse. President Carter, his face a mask of exhaustion, asked if there was any other way. There was none. With a heavy heart, he gave the order to cancel the mission. The gamble had failed. The United States had flown halfway around the world only to be defeated by a hydraulic pump and a cloud of dust. But the night was not done with them yet. Tragedy was about to turn into catastrophe. It was approximately 2:40 a.m. local time. The order was given to refuel the remaining helicopters for the flight back to the carrier. The desert was pitch black, illuminated only by the dim, filtered lights of the aircraft. Dust was still swirling, kicked up by the rotor wash of the giant machines. One of the RRH-53 helicopters lifted off to reposition itself behind a C-130 tanker plane. The pilot, likely disoriented by the brownout conditions, the swirling dust that obliterates all visual references, drifted. The rotor blades of the helicopter sliced into the vertical stabilizer of the C-130. There was a sound like the sky tearing apart. A massive fireball erupted as thousands of gallons of aviation fuel ignited instantly. The explosion lit up the desert for miles. Metal screamed. Ammunition inside the commando's gear began to cook off, popping and exploding in the intense heat. Men were thrown to the ground by the blast. Others ran into the flames, trying to pull their comrades out. But the fire was an inferno. It consumed the helicopter and the transport plane in seconds. 8 Americans died in the fire. 3 Marines and 5 Air Force personnel. Their bodies were incinerated in the wreckage of the mission that was supposed to save lives. The survivors, burned and shell-shocked, scrambled onto the remaining C-130. In the panic and the heat of the exploding ammunition, a decision was made that would haunt the military for decades. They had to leave the bodies of the dead behind. They couldn't retrieve them from the inferno. The transport planes roared down the makeshift runway and lifted off into the darkness, leaving the burning wreckage, the secret documents, and the American dead in the hands of the enemy. The phone rang in the White House. It was General David Jones, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He spoke to the president. Carter listened, his face draining of all color. He closed his eyes. The room went silent. "There has been an accident," Carter whispered. "We have lost men." Cyrus Vance was not in the Situation Room when the news broke. He was at home, or perhaps in his office, waiting for the word he dreaded. When he heard what had happened, there was no "I told you so." There was no satisfaction in being right. There was only a profound, crushing sorrow. Vance had argued against the mission because he valued human life above political desperation. He had warned that complexity breeds failure. He had warned that the desert was a graveyard for optimistic plans. Now, 8 young men were dead. The hostages were in greater danger than ever, and the United States had suffered its greatest public humiliation since the fall of Saigon. The next morning, President Carter faced the American people, his face drawn and defeated, to take full responsibility for the tragedy. But behind the scenes, the moral consequence of that disaster was already unfolding. The resignation letter Vance had submitted days earlier was now irrevocable. On Monday, April 28, 1980, Washington woke up to a political earthquake. At 12:30 p.m., the president officially announced the resignation of Cyrus Vance. In a city where departures are usually cloaked in euphemisms about health reasons, this was a moment of raw, unvarnished truth. Vance did not hold a press conference to denounce the president. He simply let the empty chair speak for itself. He had refused to support a military course he believed was wrong, and the wreckage in the desert stood as a horrific validation of his warning. The reaction was brutal. Hawks branded him the secretary of weakness, claiming he abandoned the ship when the waters were roughest. Yet, true to the code of the Kent School, Vance remained silent. He absorbed the criticism with stoic discipline, refusing to engage in public mudslinging that would further damage the country. In a final act of professional grace, instead of leaving immediately, he stayed on to assist his successor, Senator Edmund Muskie, ensuring a smooth transition for the very administration he had just resigned from. When he finally walked out of the State Department, thousands of employees lined the balconies, not to cheer a conquering hero, but to applaud a man who had dared to value his conscience over his career. He took the shuttle back to New York City, stepping out of the spotlight just as the world he knew began to unravel. The failed mission and Vance's departure effectively broke the back of the Carter presidency, paving the way for the Reagan era. Throughout the 1980s, Cyrus Vance settled into the role of the wise man in exile. As the Reagan Revolution transformed Washington, Vance was often dismissed by the new power players as a relic of the Vietnam Syndrome, a symbol of a time when America hesitated to flex its muscles. Yet, he remained the quiet conscience of the foreign policy establishment. From his office in New York, he wrote articles and gave speeches warning against the excesses of the arms race and the dangers of ignoring human rights in favor of anti-communist expediency. He watched with concern as the Cold War heated up again, but he never allowed himself to become bitter or cynical. He understood that history moves in cycles, and while the 1980s were a time for hawks, the pendulum would eventually swing back. By the end of the decade, the geopolitical landscape that had defined Vance's entire life evaporated almost overnight. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed shortly after. The Cold War was over. The binary struggle between us and them that had structured international relations for 40 years was replaced by a chaotic fragmentation of the world order. Suddenly, the threat wasn't a nuclear exchange between superpowers, but the explosion of ethnic hatreds, nationalism, and tribal violence in failing states. The cowboy diplomacy that had seemed so effective against the Soviet bloc was useless in this new, messy reality. You couldn't intimidate a tribal militia with an aircraft carrier, and you couldn't bomb a neighbor-on-neighbor civil war into submission. The world no longer needed a warrior. It needed a surgeon. In 1991, the United Nations found itself staring into the abyss of a new European catastrophe. Yugoslavia, a patchwork nation held together for decades by communist glue, was tearing itself apart. Croatia and Serbia were at war. Villages were burning, and the term ethnic cleansing was beginning to appear in intelligence reports. The UN Secretary General needed a special envoy, someone with the patience of a saint, the legal mind of a judge, and the moral authority of a man who owed nothing to anyone. He called Cyrus Vance. At 74 years old, suffering from chronic back pain that made every step an ordeal, Vance had every reason to say no. He had earned his retirement, but he believed that a lawyer's duty and a human being's duty was to serve when called. He accepted the mission, flying into the Balkans, not with an army, but with a briefcase, ready to confront the darkest side of human nature in a conflict where truth was the first casualty. The winter of 1991 in the Balkans was a season of medieval brutality superimposed on the modern world. When Cyrus Vance arrived in Yugoslavia as the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General, he stepped into a landscape that defied the logic of the Cold War diplomacy he had mastered decades earlier. This was not a conflict of ideologies or superpowers. It was a visceral, intimate war of neighbors killing neighbors. At 74 years old, suffering from a back condition so severe that he often had to lie on the floor of transport planes to endure the flights, Vance threw himself into the mud and snow of the front lines. He traveled thousands of miles in armored personnel carriers, crossing checkpoints manned by drunk, unpredictable militias, driven by a singular, desperate mission to stop the bleeding in Croatia before it consumed the entire peninsula. Vance brought a unique weapon to this chaotic battlefield, the weapon of infinite patience. He sat across tables from men like Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia and Franjo Tudjman of Croatia, nationalist leaders who viewed treaties as temporary inconveniences rather than binding commitments. Unlike the Soviet diplomats of the past, who operated within a rigid framework of state interests, these warlords lied openly and frequently. Vance, however, refused to be provoked. He applied his trademark exhaustion method, listening to their grievances for hours on end, absorbing their rage and their propaganda until they had nothing left to say. He was the only figure respected by all sides, precisely because he represented no national interest, only the abstract concept of peace. By early 1992, against all odds, he engineered the Vance Plan, a ceasefire agreement that established UN-protected areas in Croatia and deployed peacekeepers to separate the combatants. It was an imperfect peace, a bandage on a gaping wound, but it stopped the major combat operations in Croatia for 3 years, saving thousands of lives and proving that even in the midst of madness, rational negotiation could carve out a space for survival. But just as the embers were cooling in Croatia, the fire jumped the firebreak and engulfed Bosnia. In the spring of 1992, the war in Bosnia began with a ferocity that shocked the world. The siege of Sarajevo turned a cosmopolitan Olympic city into a shooting gallery, and reports of concentration camps and ethnic cleansing began to filter out of the countryside. Vance, now partnered with British diplomat Lord David Owen, was tasked with the impossible, designing a peace plan for a country that was being torn apart by 3 different armies. The Vance-Owen peace plan was an intricate map that divided Bosnia into semi-autonomous provinces, attempting to preserve the nation while acknowledging the brutal reality of ethnic separation. It was a lawyer's solution to a butcher's problem, a complex compromise intended to stop the genocide by freezing the front lines. This period marked the most agonizing chapter of Vance's public life. As he traveled between Geneva and Sarajevo, he faced a barrage of criticism from all sides. The Western press and the new Clinton administration in Washington attacked the Vance-Owen plan for being too accommodating to the Serbs, arguing that it ratified ethnic cleansing by drawing borders along ethnic lines. They demanded justice and rollback. Vance, however, was operating in the realm of the real. He looked at the Western governments and saw a profound hypocrisy. They were willing to preach about justice, but they were unwilling to send a single soldier to fight for it. Vance famously retorted to his critics that they could not have it both ways. They could not reject compromise while refusing to intervene militarily. He was trying to save living human beings with a pen, while his critics were debating moral philosophy from the safety of distant capitals. By the spring of 1993, the weight of the failure began to crush the initiative. The Bosnian Serbs rejected the plan, gambling that the West would not intervene, and the Clinton administration refused to throw its full weight behind Vance's diplomatic architecture without significant changes. Vance saw the writing on the wall. He realized that without the credible threat of American force he had once resigned to avoid, but now recognized as the only language the warlords understood, diplomacy was becoming a charade. He was being asked to negotiate with ghosts, to make promises the international community had no intention of keeping. He saw the shadow of Vietnam and the shadow of Iran, policy disconnected from reality. In April 1993, Cyrus Vance resigned as the UN Special Envoy. It was a quiet departure, devoid of the shock that had accompanied his exit in 1980, but filled with a deeper, more weary sadness. He had given the last measure of his strength to the people of the Balkans, ruining his health in the drafty conference rooms of Geneva and the shattered streets of Sarajevo. He left not because he had given up on peace, but because he refused to be the face of a diplomatic process that had become a cover for inaction. As he flew home to New York, the war in Bosnia raged on, a testament to the tragic limits of what one good man can do in a world that has chosen violence. He was returning to the silence of private life, a man of no, who had finally run out of ways to say yes to a world that wouldn't listen. After returning from the wreckage of the Balkans in 1993, Cyrus Vance finally laid down the burden of public service that he had carried for nearly half a century. He was 76 years old, and the physical toll of his life was undeniable. The back pain that had plagued him since the Johnson administration was now a constant companion, a physical reminder of the weight he had borne for the state. He retreated to the quiet dignity of his life in New York City, surrounded by his wife Grace and their children. For a man who had stood at the center of the world's most dangerous storms, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iran to the sniper alleys of Sarajevo, the silence of private life was both a relief and a strange new reality. He returned to his law office at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett, not to manage crises, but to serve as a mentor, the gray eminence whom younger lawyers approached with a mixture of awe and reverence. But the final tragedy of Cyrus Vance's life was not geopolitical. It was deeply personal. In the late 1990s, the sharp crystalline mind that had unraveled the complexities of SALT II and the Camp David Accords began to falter. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. It was a cruel irony that a man who had defined his life by memory, detail, and precise logic was slowly stripped of those very tools. As the 20th century bled into the 21st, Vance began to fade. He watched from a distance as the world transformed yet again. He lived to see the horrific morning of September 11th, 2001, when the skyline of his beloved New York was shattered by terror. One can only imagine the thoughts of the old diplomat as he watched the smoke rise over Manhattan, perhaps a final sorrowful recognition that the cycle of violence he had spent his life trying to break was beginning all over again. Cyrus Roberts Vance passed away on January 12, 2002, at the age of 84. His funeral was not a spectacle of state, but a gathering of the faithful. The great and the good of the American establishment came to pay their respects, but the atmosphere was different from the usual Washington send-off. There was a sense that they were burying not just a man, but an ethic. They were burying a representative of a time when a public official would choose honor over power and silence over spin. He was laid to rest with the quiet dignity that had characterized his every action, leaving behind a silence that has arguably never been filled. So, what is the true legacy of Cyrus Vance? In the history books, he is often overshadowed by the louder, more colorful figures of his era, the swashbuckling Henry Kissinger, the aggressive Zbigniew Brzezinski, or the tragic Lyndon Johnson. Vance is often remembered for the things that went wrong: the failed rescue mission, the resignation, the imperfect peace plans in the Balkans. But to view him through the lens of success and failure is to miss the point of his life entirely. Cyrus Vance was not a man of victory in the traditional sense. He was a man of limits. He was the guardrail on the highway of American power. We live in a world that worships action. We build statues to the leaders who start wars, who invade nations, and who make the bold, aggressive moves that change maps. We rarely celebrate the men who say, "Stop." We don't give medals for the catastrophes that didn't happen because someone had the patience to keep talking. Vance's legacy is the courage of the empty chair. When he walked out of the State Department in April 1980, he shattered the cardinal rule of Washington that you must stay in the room to have influence. He proved that the ultimate influence lies in the refusal to be complicit in what you know is wrong. He showed that loyalty to a president is secondary to loyalty to one's conscience and to the lives of the soldiers sent to die for political desperation. In the end, the story of Cyrus Vance is a counter-narrative to the 20th century. It is the story of a man who saw the meat grinder of Vietnam and learned to hate war, yet never stopped trying to fix the world that war created. It is the story of a man who held the keys to the most powerful military machine in history and was brave enough to keep them in his pocket. He teaches us that true strength is not found in the roar of a helicopter or the blast of a missile, but in the quiet, unglamorous, and often lonely determination to remain human in a room full of people who have forgotten what that means. The empty chair he left behind in the Situation Room remains his monument, a permanent reminder to every future leader that there is always a choice, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a statesman can do is simply walk away.